In early winter of 1795, the Hawkesbury frontier was a thin strip of farms pressed against forest, floodplain, and hunger, where rumour travelled faster than patrols, and every missing sack of maize felt like a death sentence. On the 7th of June, near Richmond Hill, tension that had been building for months snapped into open fighting between Darug groups defending country and armed colonial forces trying to secure the settlements and their stores. Richmond Hill was not a single neat battlefield, but a landscape of ridges, creek lines, and scattered huts between Parramatta's outer edge and the river flats, where paths crossed food grounds and fences, cut old routes. For Darug families, the expansion meant fewer yams, disrupted fishing places, and constant intrusion. For settlers, it meant crops exposed to raids and retaliation. In that pressure, small clashes turned into a larger confrontation, remembered as a defining frontier battle. Colonial accounts framed the crisis as theft and disorder, yet the deeper cause was survival on both sides, sharpened by fear and misunderstanding. Settlers depended on harvests and livestock that could not be moved quickly. Darug resistance drew on knowledge of terrain and the conviction that country was being taken by force. By the time the alarm rose at Richmond Hill, both communities expected violence, and each interpreted the other's actions as the opening move of a wider assault. Captain William Paterson emerged as a key figure on the colonial side, tasked with restoring control when local settlers alone could not hold the line. Paterson's detachment represented organized power. Muskets, drill, and a chain of command meant to turn panic into coordinated action. He had to balance speed and caution because the frontier could swallow small parties, yet delay invited more raids and more fear. His march toward the fighting aimed to disperse resistance and protect grain. On the Darug side, Pemulwuy is often remembered as a leading figure of resistance, a man associated with daring attacks, tactical movement, and the ability to draw fighters together across kin groups in moments of crisis. Darug leadership was not a single uniform command, but influence mattered, and Pemulwuy's name appears repeatedly in traditions and colonial reports as a rallying force. At Richmond Hill, Darug fighters used familiarity with bush corridors and creek cover to strike, withdraw, and strike again. The clash itself unfolded through sound, smoke, and sudden contact. Scattered gunfire, shouted warnings, and movement through scrub, where visibility collapsed to a few paces. Colonial forces relied on volleys and the threat of bayonets. Darug warriors relied on speed, concealment, and the ability to choose when to close and when to vanish. In such fighting, fear was a weapon, because a musket misfire or a broken formation could turn a patrol into prey, and a rushed pursuit could become an ambush. Some sources later called Richmond Hill the first recorded battle between settlers and Aboriginal people in that district, not because violence began there, but because the paperwork of a colony captured this moment in a way earlier clashes were not. Reports, journals, and official correspondence turned the day into a reference point. A named event tied to a place, a commander, and a recognized opponent. That record also shaped memory because it preserved colonial priorities, while only partly capturing Darug motives and losses. After the fighting, the frontier did not calm, it hardened. Settlers demanded stronger protection and more punitive expeditions, convinced that security required force. Darug communities faced intensified patrols and the increasing risk that any encounter could be treated as hostile. The struggle became a cycle. Raids answered by reprisals, reprisals answered by new raids, each turn narrowing the space for negotiation. Richmond Hill thus acted as a hinge, pushing relations away from uneasy coexistence toward a militarized frontier. Paterson's role illustrates how the colony converted fear into policy. When local defense failed, authority answered with organized violence and a promise of order, yet that order depended on dispossession continuing. Pemulwuy's prominence illustrates the other side of the hinge. Resistance becoming personal and symbolic, a name that colonial officials repeated because they recognized the threat, and a name that later memory held on to because it represented refusal. Their confrontation was less duel than collision between incompatible claims to land and life. In documentary terms, Richmond Hill matters because it shows how a young colony learned to fight on contested ground and how Darug resistance adapted under pressure long before later wars were named and mapped. The 7th of June, 1795 stands as a brutal marker in the Hawkesbury story. A day when frontier conflict became unmistakably public, leaders became legible in the record, and the river district's future tilted toward expansion enforced by arms, met by determination that did not surrender. In the days after the 7th of June, 1795, the Hawkesbury settlements lived inside a new rhythm. Night watches, muskets kept close, and constant speculation about where the next blow would fall. The farms at Richmond Hill were still fragile clearings on contested ground, and the clash had not ended the dispute so much as proved that a larger conflict was already underway. For settlers, the question became how to hold the river flats without losing the harvest. For Darug families, the question became how to survive an expanding net of patrols. Colonial correspondence and later summaries describe the confrontation as a serious alarm, the kind that demanded official action rather than local self-defense. Captain William Paterson's presence mattered because it signaled that the colony was willing to treat the district as a military problem. On paper, the purpose was protection of lives and property. In practice, protection meant tighter control over movement, more armed parties on the tracks, and a readiness to punish entire groups for the actions of some. That shift raised the stakes for every encounter at a creek crossing or along a fence line. The Hawkesbury was a place where geography shaped violence. The river could flood, turning fields into shallow lakes and forcing travelers onto higher ground and narrow ridges. The bush offered concealment and short lines of approach, but also trapped the unwary. A party marching in column could be watched for hours without seeing anyone, then struck at the edge of a clearing. For Darug warriors, knowledge of paths and cover allowed rapid concentration and dispersal. For colonial forces, the challenge was to avoid being drawn into terrain where muskets and drill meant less. In many frontier fights, the decisive element was not the first shot, but the decisions made after it. Pursuit could satisfy anger and feel like courage, yet pursuit also carried men away from shelter and toward unknown ground. Paterson and other officers had to discipline settlers who wanted immediate revenge, because uncontrolled chases could end in ambush and panic. At the same time, if patrols seemed hesitant, settlers would accuse the authorities of weakness. Leadership meant managing both battlefield tactics and the emotional pressure of a community that feared hunger as much as attack. On the Darug side, resistance drew strength from networks of kinship and shared obligation to country. Pemulwuy's name appears in colonial reporting because he was associated with repeated action, the ability to return after setbacks, and the capacity to turn the frontier's scattered incidents into something that looked, to settlers, like coordinated threat. Darug's strategy did not require standing formations. It required choosing time and place, striking where farms were isolated, and reminding the settlers that fences did not equal control. The violence around Richmond Hill was tied to food. Maize, livestock, and tools were not luxuries on the Hawkesbury. They were the difference between endurance and starvation. When raids targeted stores, settlers interpreted it as criminality, but it also reflected the fact that traditional food grounds were being fenced and cleared. The colonial economy depended on converting land into crops, while Darug's survival depended on access to the same ground in a different way. That collision meant that even a small theft could be treated as a strategic attack. After the clash, colonial officials increasingly framed the situation in terms of deterrence, the idea that harsh measures would prevent future resistance. That meant more patrols, more armed escorts, and punitive expeditions meant to demonstrate power. These actions did not simply restore peace. They often widened the sense of grievance because punishment could fall on people who were not present in a particular raid or fight. The frontier became a space where collective blame was easier than careful understanding, and where the rule of fear substituted for negotiated coexistence. For Darug communities, increased militarization meant that ordinary movement became dangerous. Crossing near a farm could be read as scouting. Carrying spears could be read as intent. Gathering near the river could be read as a threat. Yet avoiding the river flats and wooded corridors also meant giving up access to resources and routes. The pressure forced difficult choices: resist and risk reprisal, or withdraw and watch country be taken piece by piece. Richmond Hill thus stands not only as a battle but as a turning point in the shrinking space for Darug autonomy in that district. When later writers called it the first recorded battle in the region, they captured an administrative reality. This was the kind of alarm that reached desks and became part of official memory. But the record is uneven. It tells us who commanded colonial forces and how settlers described events, while it only hints at Darug perspectives and losses. A documentary approach has to read the archive with caution, separating what is described from what is assumed, and remembering that silence in the sources does not mean absence on the ground. The aftermath of Richmond Hill therefore matters as much as the day itself. It intensified patrol culture, sharpened the colony's reliance on armed force, and elevated Pemulwuy's reputation as a leader who would not be contained by one confrontation. It also demonstrated that the Hawkesbury frontier was becoming a true war zone, where both sides acted under existential pressure. In the next part, we will follow how this escalation shaped further raids, reprisals, and the hardening identity of resistance around Pemulwuy's name. As the Hawkesbury frontier moved from shock to routine after the clash at Richmond Hill, violence became less an exception and more a pattern that structured everyday decisions. Settlers rebuilt fences and stored grain as if preparing for siege, while Aboriginal families adjusted movement and gathering as if every track might now hide a musket. The 7th of June, 1795 did not conclude anything. It marked the moment when both sides understood that the district had crossed into sustained conflict. Colonial forces tried to impose predictability through patrols, escorts, and rapid response. The logic was simple. If armed parties could appear quickly, raids would be discouraged and farms would feel safer. Yet the landscape resisted control. The river flats, gullies, and bush corridors created many lines of approach, and the frontier's scattered farms meant there were always weak points. A patrol could protect one cluster of huts while another homestead, a mile away, stood exposed. This gap between promised security and lived fear pushed settlers to demand harsher measures. Those demands shaped policy. Officials heard the language of desperation. Claims that the district could not survive another season of raids, that families would abandon their grants, that the colony's food supply was at risk. In response, the colony leaned on punitive expeditions as both punishment and theatre. Armed parties moved through the bush to demonstrate dominance, to seize spears or canoes, to burn shelters, or to capture individuals accused of leading attacks. The message was meant to be unmistakable. Resistance would bring collective suffering. For Darug communities, this approach confirmed the worst suspicion, that the colony would treat the presence of Aboriginal people near farms as hostile by default. If a hunting party was seen on the edge of a clearing, it could draw shots. If a camp was found, it could be destroyed. This pressure did not eliminate resistance. It changed its form. The safest response was often to avoid direct confrontation unless conditions were favorable, then strike quickly at isolated targets and disappear into country that the colonists did not read as a map, but as a wall of green. Pemulwuy's reputation grew in precisely this environment. Colonial reports repeatedly associated him with daring raids and an ability to recover after setbacks, making him both a practical threat and a symbol. For settlers, he became the name that explained insecurity, the personification of an enemy they could not control. For Aboriginal memory and later retellings, he represents refusal, a leader who chose to fight for country when the balance of weapons favored the invaders. Richmond Hill helped fix this contrast because it made the confrontation visible at an official level. The clash also hardened the colony's view of the Hawkesbury as a frontier requiring military solutions. Officers like Paterson were valued not only for courage but for discipline, because undisciplined vengeance could spiral into disaster. A musket line might hold in open ground, but in thick scrub it could collapse into scattered firing, friendly confusion, and wasted powder. Paterson's challenge was to prevent fear from turning into reckless pursuit, while still projecting strength. That tension defined frontier command. Every decision had to manage both enemy tactics and settler panic. In such a setting, misunderstandings became lethal. Settlers read silence in the bush as preparation for attack. Darug families read fences and armed patrols as preparation for dispossession. A single theft accusation could trigger a reprisal. A reprisal could trigger a raid, and each cycle widened the list of those who wanted revenge. The frontier stopped being a line of contact and became a machine that produced violence. Richmond Hill fits into this as a visible gear, a documented moment that accelerated the turning. The idea that the battle was the first recorded one in the district matters, because recording is power. What is written becomes the official story, and official stories become justification. Colonial writing often emphasized property loss and the need for order, while minimizing the invasion of food grounds and sacred places that lay behind Darug resistance. A documentary narration must hold both truths, that settlers feared starvation and attack, and that Aboriginal families faced a systematic taking of land that threatened survival at a deeper level than one season's crop. Over time, the Hawkesbury conflict would be remembered through the names that appear in the archive. Paterson on one side, Pemulwuy on the other. Yet behind those names were many people whose identities were not preserved in writing. Farmers who carried muskets to the fields, women and children who hid during alarms, Darug warriors who struck and vanished, elders who weighed whether to retreat or to fight. Richmond Hill is therefore both a battle and a lens, showing how colonial expansion converts local tensions into militarized confrontation. By the end of this phase, the district's atmosphere had changed permanently. Security became something measured in armed presence, not in trust. Movement became something judged by suspicion, not by custom. Pemulwuy's continued prominence ensured that the conflict did not fade into isolated incidents. In the next part, we will connect Richmond Hill's escalation to the broader pattern of frontier war around Sydney, and to how the colony's responses shaped the long struggle between expansion and resistance. As the conflict radiated outward from Richmond Hill, it began to resemble a frontier war in the full sense, not a single battle, but a chain of alarms, retaliations, and calculated strikes that reshaped the relationship between Sydney's expanding colony and the Darug world. The Hawkesbury became a proving ground for colonial authority, where officials tested how much force it would take to keep farms planted and roads passable. For Darug families, it became a zone of constant risk, where presence on country could be treated as a threat, and where every loss tightened the will to resist. The colony's strategy leaned heavily on visibility. Patrols marched with the expectation that being seen would deter attacks, and punishments were designed to be talked about. This was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The administration needed settlers to believe protection was real, because abandonment of farms would endanger the colony's food supply and credibility. Yet visibility had limits. A patrol could be watched from the bush without being detected, and a show of force could miss the people it meant to intimidate. The frontier remained porous, and that porosity fed the myth that Aboriginal resistance was everywhere. Captain William Paterson's role in this broader view represents the colony's dependence on disciplined officers to impose coherence on a frightened frontier. Paterson was not simply a fighter, he was a manager of violence. He had to coordinate soldiers and armed settlers, decide when to advance, when to hold, and how to prevent chaos from turning into needless casualties. His decisions, recorded in colonial memory, contributed to a narrative that the colony acted defensively. But defense, in a settler colonial context, often meant defending an act of taking land that the other side experienced as aggression. Darug resistance, associated in the colonial record with Pemulwuy, drew strength from a different kind of coherence, not paperwork and drill, but intimate knowledge of terrain and the social ties that allowed fighters to gather and disperse. Pemulwuy's leadership is remembered because he embodied persistence. He survived in a landscape where capture or death was a constant threat, and he continued to strike at symbols of colonial security, farms, stores, and the illusion that fences could replace authority. In that sense, Richmond Hill did not create him. It amplified his significance in both fear and memory. The escalation also sharpened the moral language each side used about the other. Settlers increasingly spoke of security and order, placing raids into a framework of crime. Darug communities experienced the same events as defense of country and survival against encroachment. This clash of meanings made compromise harder. When one side believes it is policing criminals, and the other believes it is resisting invasion, even gestures of negotiation can be read as traps. Richmond Hill stands at the moment when this divergence became harder to ignore. On the ground, the war was fought through small actions that carried enormous consequences. A stolen bag of maize could feed people, but it could also provoke a punitive expedition that destroyed a camp. A reprisal could satisfy a settler's sense of justice, but it could also recruit more fighters into resistance. The spiral tightened because both sides were operating under scarcity and fear. In winter, hunger made decisions sharper, and the Hawkesbury's cold, wet ground made every march harder, every night watch longer, every rumour more believable. The label first recorded battle has a double edge. It highlights that the documentation of the colony captured Richmond Hill as a major confrontation, yet it also risks suggesting that conflict began there. In reality, violence preceded record-keeping, and record-keeping itself was selective. Colonial writing often counted losses in property and European lives, while treating Aboriginal losses as vague or incidental. A documentary narrative has to restore proportionality by acknowledging that invisibility in the archive does not mean insignificance in history. The broader Sydney region was also learning lessons. Richmond Hill showed that Aboriginal resistance could concentrate quickly and threaten multiple points, and that settlers' vulnerability was structural. It also demonstrated that brute force could suppress an immediate threat but could not resolve the underlying issue of dispossession. The colony's expansion into river flats and food grounds was not a temporary patrol problem. It was a permanent transformation. Each new farm was a new flashpoint, and each flashpoint increased the likelihood of another Richmond Hill. Over time, names became anchors for the story because names can be recorded and repeated. Paterson became the face of organized response, while Pemulwuy became the face of organized resistance. Yet the reality was a wide human field, families hiding in huts during alarms, Darug elders weighing survival options, young warriors learning how muskets sounded and how quickly they could be reloaded, settlers learning that the bush was not empty. Richmond Hill matters because it made these realities collide in a way that demanded attention from the colony's leadership. By the end of this phase, the frontier had acquired a kind of inevitability. Farms would keep pushing outward, and resistance would keep returning, because both were tied to survival as each side defined it. Richmond Hill, on the 7th of June, 1795, thus becomes a marker of escalation. The day the district's conflict became legible as war in the colonial record, and the day Darug resistance was framed around a leader's name. In the final part, we will close the story by tracing how this legacy shaped memory, policy, and the continuing struggle around the Hawkesbury. The final part of the Richmond Hill story is not a clean ending, but a reckoning with what the 7th of June, 1795 set in motion. The clash is remembered because it made frontier war visible in the colonial record. A named place, a named day, a named officer, and a named Aboriginal leader. Yet visibility is not the same as completeness. What survives in writing is only a slice of what was lived on the Hawkesbury. Fear in the night, hunger in the morning, and a growing certainty on both sides that the other would not yield without force. In colonial memory, Captain William Paterson's role represents the moment when the colony tried to turn panic into procedure. His detachment stood for discipline, musket volleys, command structure, and the promise that authority could secure farms. From the settlers' perspective, this was necessary protection, because the river district fed the colony, and abandonment would have been catastrophic. Paterson's presence also shows how quickly the Hawkesbury was elevated from a local problem to a strategic concern, where security policy was inseparable from the continued expansion of settlement. In Aboriginal memory and in later historical focus, Pemulwuy represents the opposite force. Refusal. His name appears repeatedly because the colony recognized him as persistent and capable, and because resistance needed figures who embodied resolve. Darug leadership operated through influence and network rather than formal rank, but influence mattered intensely in a crisis. Richmond Hill, described by some sources as the first recorded battle in the region, amplified Pemulwuy's place in the narrative, turning him into both a practical opponent and a symbol of country defending itself against enclosure. What Richmond Hill revealed most clearly was that the Hawkesbury conflict was driven by survival. Settlers lived with fragile supply lines and a fear of starvation, where the loss of maize or livestock could mean collapse. Darug families faced a deeper survival threat: the progressive taking of food grounds, the disruption of movement corridors, and the transformation of river flats into fenced property. When both sides interpret the same landscape as necessary to live, violence becomes more likely and compromise becomes harder because each concession feels like surrender. The aftermath hardened the frontier's logic. Colonial authorities leaned toward deterrence through force, believing that punishment would reduce attacks. But punitive expeditions often widened grievance because collective punishment does not isolate guilt. It spreads anger. The frontier then becomes a cycle: raid, reprisal, raid. Richmond Hill fits as a hinge within that cycle, a moment that encouraged the colony to militarize its response and encouraged Darug resistance to become more tactical, more selective, and more focused on striking where the colony felt secure. The label, First Recorded Battle, is best understood as a comment on documentation rather than a claim about origins. Violence did not begin because a clerk noticed it. It began because settlement expanded into inhabited country and enforced that expansion with weapons. Richmond Hill is recorded because it alarmed the colony enough to generate reports and correspondence, and because those records helped shape future policy. The danger is that record-keeping can make earlier conflict seem smaller or less real. A documentary narrative has to keep insisting that what was not recorded could still be decisive. Richmond Hill also shows how frontier war is made out of small moments. A patrol that fires too early, a settler who pursues too far, a warrior who chooses the edge of a clearing rather than the open flat. These decisions, repeated, teach both sides. Settlers learned to fear the bush as a space of invisible movement. Darug warriors learned to read musket drill and exploit the limits of European tactics in thick scrub. Over time, this learning deepened the conflict because both sides became better at fighting and therefore more likely to choose fighting. In the longer arc around Sydney, the Hawkesbury remained a zone of repeated confrontation, and Pemulwuy's continued resistance became one of the most famous threads in that story. Paterson's actions at Richmond Hill belong to the early phase of the colony's attempt to secure expansion through organized force. Pemulwuy's actions belong to the early phase of Aboriginal resistance adapting to that force. The battle's significance lies in how it made these two phases meet. Authority stepping forward, resistance stepping forward, and the river district becoming a contested space that could no longer be described as merely settled. Memory, however, can simplify what was complex. It can turn a series of shifting contacts into a single heroic tale, or a single notorious raid into a permanent judgment. The documentary challenge is to keep the human scale. Settlers who were afraid and often desperate, Aboriginal families who were defending lifeways and country, and leaders who acted within brutal constraints. Richmond Hill is neither a romantic duel nor a neat lesson. It is a snapshot of a world being forcibly remade and of people refusing to disappear quietly. That is why the 7th of June, 1795, still matters. It stands as a marker of escalation on the Hawkesbury, a day that entered the archive and shaped how the colony spoke about security, and a day that helped fix Pemulwuy's name as a symbol of Darug resistance. The battle did not end the war. It revealed it. And in revealing it, Richmond Hill showed how quickly a frontier can become a war zone when expansion is backed by arms and met by a determination to defend country at any cost.